Looking ahead.
So, as we have discussed a bit of the banking system in our previous episodes, obviously the natural question of how does a bank make its money comes into question, and certainly with the world evolving, basically the point of transaction costs. So, Barry, you've seen you've come across an example of an extremely low transaction cost on a particular transaction. Please talk us through that.
Sure thing. So yeah, transaction costs are the friction in the financial system, right? They're the reason that banks exist, and that's kind of how they make their money, like you said. And a lot of the talk around cryptocurrency and blockchain technology is by trying to take out those intermediaries and save on those transaction costs in between. So I came across this very interesting thing. There's a Twitter account called, I think it's Bitcoin Whales, I think it's called. Okay. And what it does is it tracks the biggest Bitcoin transactions there are around the world and just tweets them out. And because Bitcoin is a fully public ledger, you can look at every transaction ever made. You can see the amounts, who sent it to who, etc., etc. And so I saw this tweet where there was a transaction, I think it's about a week or so ago now. Someone transferred 44,000 Bitcoin. And just to put that in perspective, that is worth, at the time of the transfer, $310 million US.
Wow.
That is a significant amount of money to be sending, and I can only speculate as to what that was for.
Sure.
It seems like drug money. It has to be drug money. I don't know what else it could be. But $310 million US transferred like this, and what the transaction cost was for that was 32 US cents. Wow. Which is basically negligible.
Yep.
So that is an example of the kind of frictionless environment that cryptocurrency tries to provide and tries to talk about, and it's quite a scary number. And if you think about that in the perspective of what banks would have charged for that kind of transfer, it's chalk and cheese. And so I wanted to bring that up and hear about your thoughts, Chad. I know you've done a little bit of work in foreign exchange yourself, so what do you think on this?
I mean, the really interesting thing here is, firstly, so if we look at that 32 cents, in terms of who that would have been paid to, my understanding is that would be paid to anyone who is actually mining Bitcoin. In other words, keeping the ledger going. So that was my first point, which I think is really interesting in terms of, a shared sort of shared remuneration, if you'd like. In terms of the actual transfer, the interesting thing here is obviously Bitcoin, is not legislated, and so very interesting that it could go from one end of the globe to the other, not having passed through any sort of exchange controls or anything like that. In terms of the fees that a bank might charge for something like this, let's assume it was a domestic transaction. We would have seen sizable fees. Let's also add into this equation that it was an international transfer, and now you're looking at really, really sizable fees. I mean, certainly the work that you referred to in terms of basically, I did a due diligence before on a foreign exchange intermediary in South Africa. So essentially, where the intermediary isn't actually the ultimate trader, but basically arranges the buying and selling, and arranges the person who's actually ultimately doing that trade. And I think it's certainly an interesting place. I think long gone are the days where banks charge 3% on the commission. So that's the rate that they basically build in to this foreign exchange rate. And I mean, on top of that, you see sort of foreign exchange transfer fees as well. So, I mean, considering that this person paid 32 cents for, $310 million is scary. Certainly for the sort of exchange regulations and that kind of thing as well, it's going to be very interesting to see if this one's going to be picked up on anyone's radar. As you said, it's a public ledger. Do you know of any countries keeping an eye on big transfers like this? And in terms of that information that you mentioned that is available to the public, when you say you can see who transferred to who, is it anonymized in some sort of way? Are we just talking about wallet code names? Are we talking about actual particulars of individuals?
Yeah, so that's the reason that the countries can't really catch these guys, is because these wallets are anonymized, and it's simply two codes sending one to another.
Right.
And that code can be masked by what's called a private key in some instances. And so while you can see the transaction, you can see that person A sent to person B, you don't know who those people are. And so I think all countries are battling with this. How do you regulate this? How do you try and get your hands on that money? How do you ensure that the exchange controls are being met? And at the moment, no one's got it right yet. And that's the whole point of cryptocurrency. That's the whole point of Bitcoin, is to do away with all of this friction in the marketplace. And so it's a very controversial one. I think that this is definitely going to be on the radars of a lot of people. And we've seen huge amounts before. I'm not sure ever this much amount, but I've seen huge transactions go through before. Yeah. And this is what the Bitcoin fanatics are pointing towards as the future of financial services. They imagine a world where sending someone money across the world is as easy as sending an email, and it's just a commodity. Because at the end of the day, all it's doing is it's sending numbers over the internet, right? We're not sending gold bars here. We're not sending notes. There's nothing to be transferred. Sure. And so in a Bitcoin world, sending 1 cent and sending $100 million costs the same amount of money because it's just numbers on a screen. And so it challenges this whole conception of what is value going to look like in the next 100 years? What are our children going to use to transact with? How are they going to get around? And for someone like, we spoke about Venezuela earlier. Venezuela's been a huge Bitcoin hotbed because their own currency has been devalued so quickly that people have been moving their life savings into Bitcoin so they can send it to their family members around the world. So I think it's a fascinating thing to watch. I find it hard to think how the regulators are going to get a handle on this. Yep. But we'll have to keep our eyes on it and see what happens.
Yeah, certainly not a new topic. I mean, something that's been developing over the last few number of years. I mean, I personally thought, a lot of the sort of initial fuss had kind of died down a bit. I mean, I certainly knew friends who were personally sort of investing, if you'd like, in these bitcoins, and a lot of them had made quite a bit of profits in a really short period of time. But ultimately, a lot of them also lost a lot of money. And just in terms of confidence in the system, I'm surprised to still see such a big transaction materializing in however many years that had passed since the initial trend. But I mean, just certainly in terms of this cash. My sort of understanding is that somebody would still cash this out in some form of hard currency, or are there people who believe there are going to be vendors in the future and essentially are they kind of just taking a risk that this 44,000 Bitcoin will still be worth that same amount, or does it look like this type of transaction would still be cashed out into hard currency?
Yeah, so that's the biggest struggle with the system at the moment, is that in order to cash that money out, you have to go through what's called an on-ramp, and that on-ramp is into fiat currency, so through a bank or someone is willing to cash that out. And that's when the regulator can finally get their hands on it, right? And so a lot of these transactions are sitting as Bitcoin in the system at the moment because there aren't many off-ramps, and the ones that they are very highly regulated and very highly watched. Right. And so I would think that this guy would be holding onto this cash. I think that what you spoke about, the hype, I think is a very relevant point, but also the hype was this frothy top where people who didn't understand the technology were getting in because the price was going through the roof, right? There are still a huge majority of the Bitcoin ecosystem who believes in this as a long-term change to the financial system and are not just speculating based on price. So I'm actually one of those people, and I still own Bitcoin. I've invested for a long time now. And I think that, I'm just mentioning that for disclosure purposes, because I am a fan of the technology. And I think that the speculation of our friends and stuff who have been investing and then losing money and then winning money and whatnot, that was all merely gambling because it was so early in the technology. But there is a groundswell of people who believe this is the future and are willing to leave their value in these systems and not cash it out because they believe in the future there are going to be vendors who are going to accept it, when it comes to online banking or buying goods and services or rent or investing in houses or all those kinds of things. Yeah, so I think it's an interesting space to watch. I think that cryptocurrency has caused a lot of debate and a lot of talking in the technology space. The banks are quivering, that's for sure, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to impact this new world. And transactions like this just show some of the value that cryptocurrency fanatics have been talking about. If we get to a world where there's frictionless payments, frictionless transfers across borders, what is that going to look like on a global scale? And what does that mean for the huge industry that are the middlemen in all of this, right? The middlemen who are doing these transfers. So we have to watch the space. I think it's still far away, but we'll have to look at what happens.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on that. And yeah, I'm absolutely fascinating that those types of sizable transactions are still going on in the platform. Across the pond.